sure we've got.
Right, now we can. A roll call, please.
Good evening, everybody, and I hope you all had a good Thanksgiving. If this is working, this looks like it's running out of juice too. Yeah, that works. All right, this is the Architectural Review Committee meeting of December 2nd, 2024. And I will take the roll call. Member Castro.
Here.
Member Thompson.
Here.
Member McDonald.
Present.
Member Baston.
Here.
Member Harland is excused. Member Walsh.
Here.
Vice Chair Thomas.
Present.
And Chair O'Donnell.
Here,
You have a quorum.
great, thank you. You sound a little echoey.
It's not a personal comment.
Yeah,
Let me try pushing it back and see if that's better.
yeah, okay. All right, can we have a report of the posting and the agenda?
Yes, the agenda for this meeting was posted for public access at the City Hall Bulletin Board in the west side of Council Chamber and at the Planning Services counter by 9 p.m. on Wednesday, November 27th, 2024.
All right, thank you. Acceptance of the agenda. Mr. Lyon, is there anything that the planning department wants to pull out of order? Or are there any other additions?
There are no other additions, and unless any of you wish to pull anything, we are proposing the agenda as submitted.
Okay. Does anybody have any conflicts on tonight's agenda? Would anybody like to pull items from the consent calendar, which are 1B, 1C, and 1D? Okay, for those of you in the audience who have a project under the consent calendar 1A or 1B, 1C, or 1D, we are going to accept the consent calendar so you can leave, go home, have dinner, and enjoy your evening. Yeah, so item 1B, request by,
Mr. Chair?
Yep.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. I need to have a vote on the acceptance of the agenda.
okay. We will move to the acceptance of the agenda.
So moved.
With a second.
Second.
All those in
Was
favor?
that Russ? Who
Russ.
seconded?
Yes.
Okay.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Unanimous.
Thank you.
All right. Should I move to public comments or?
Yes, please.
All right. Public comments, this time is set aside for members of the public to address the Architectural Review Committee on the consent calendar and any other agenda items and items of general interest within the subject matter jurisdiction of the board. Although the Architectural Review Committee values your comments pursuant to the Brown Act, it generally cannot take any action on items not listed on the posted agenda. Are there any public comments? Anybody online?
I'm checking.
Okay.
Nope.
All right, so we will move on to the consent calendar. So let's start with A, approval of the minutes from the October 21st, 2024.
Mr. Chair?
Yep.
As you take on the consent, you're gonna vote on all these at one time.
Including the approval of the minutes.
Yes.
All
If
right,
there are any corrections that you need to advise us about on the correction minutes, we'll pick those up and then you can complete the vote on all items.
okay. Does anybody want to pull anything or clarify anything on the consent calendar? Including approval of the minutes? Okay. So we need a motion.
So moved.
Okay, we got a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
We have a motion and a second to approve the consent calendar items A, B, C, and D. Should we have a roll call vote or should we just
Why don't we just vote by voice?
by voice? All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Unanimous.
Thank you.
Okay. So unfinished business, 2A, request by the Heritage Group on behalf of the property owner Sahul Mazrahi for a major architectural application to construct a 15-unit multi-family residential development on 1.37 acres located within the Section 14 specific plan at 211 North Sunrise Way, Zone MDR, case number AR-2023-0103. Staff report, please.
Hello, I don't think it's working. Good evening, Chair and committee members. So the proposed project is a major architectural application for a 15-unit multifamily residence with dwelling ranges that range between 1,300 to 1,800 square feet, all 2-story buildings, and vary between 1, 2, and 3 bedrooms. And just for a little context, the site sits on near the corner of East Andreas Road and North Sunrise Way, surrounded by existing residential and commercial development. At the ARC meeting on September 3rd, the project was reviewed and continued by the ARC with the instruction that the applicant provide additional information and make minor modifications to the proposed project, particularly regarding the following: provide additional exhibits for the floor plan elevation and renderings of the project, include additional dimensions on the site plan, enhance solar control, modify the balcony on building A, show the west side of the elevation of the adjacent building, and study the project massing. So the applicant has addressed these comments. Additional dimensions were provided on the site plan and the floor plan to show how far an overhang extends, to show the recessed portions of the buildings, and to include the distance between the pool and the adjacent property lines. The pool sits 12 feet 3 inches from the adjacent property line, and the adjacent building is located approximately 34 feet away from the proposed project's recreational facility. Alright, you can see on the screen the previous version of the plans and revised on the left, the right, sorry. Modifications to building A were addressed by breaking up the long balcony and reconfiguring the floor plan for a few of the units. You can see the long balcony on the previous floor plan and how it's been revised on the right. Particularly this area right here, this shows the balconies, that long balcony, and these are the balconies broken up, these dark brown areas. This elevation provides a clearer picture of the balcony changes, again, previously balcony building A, as it was and as it's proposed now. Solar control is addressed by providing 3-foot overhangs above the main windows and doors as illustrated above. These overhangs are constructed using the same colors and materials as the main building. Again, the previous version shows these windows exposed to the elements, whereas the revised version has these overhangs above. On building B, A, B, and C, all the buildings. Additional shading was requested in the recreation area. The project already proposes 2 shade structures, approximately 300 square feet each, within this area, so additional shade devices were not provided. However, there will be trees implanted within this area, so that will provide additional solar control as well. The applicant has provided 2 exhibits that show a clearer understanding of the adjacent building and the proposed project. This is a view from this is a view looking northwest, and then this is a view looking southeast. So the simplification of massing was suggested, however, no changes were made to the overall massing or color of the 3 buildings. The design remains consistent with the original concepts. The color material board have remained the same. The applicant has provided additional renderings to show, as requested by the ARC, to show just different angles of the units as they are proposed. The applicant has also provided very detailed renderings and elevations of the models. So this includes those lines. You can see the.
You're out of here?
some of the drawings that reflect
Okay,
the dimensions.
you too.
This was provided for all models. And 94.04 requires the approval authority to evaluate the application for the 13 criteria and findings as analyzed in the staff report. Staff recommends approval of the major architectural application, subject to the attached conditions of approval. That concludes my report, and the applicant is available for any questions.
All right, do we have any questions of staff?
Can you confirm, did you say that the separation between the pool and the adjacent property was 30 feet?
34.
34.
Can you also clarify for us the setbacks? There was an exhibit that shows a rear yard setback with non-usable space. So there was a 20 or 25-foot setback. What, is any of that covered or is all of that outdoor?
Which is, I guess which unit are you referring to?
Okay, so I'm referring to an exhibit that showed us a rear yard setback with a roof detail or a roof plan. And there were items that appeared, and maybe it was just graphic, they appeared the same color as the roof. Should I have the exhibit? Yeah. Let's see. Yeah, so it is sheet. It's the one that's just this floor plan?
Yeah, page 6, I think.
Or 6 of the car.
Yeah. Right there. I think you were there. Right there.
Okay, and there's a red dashed line,
Mm-hmm.
and the red dashed line indicates what? Is the red dashed line the required setback, or is the red dashed line?
One second.
So setbacks, second.
Yeah, there's, so the applicant has provided setbacks for the first story and the second story, and I wanna say it's for the second.
Yes, second level setback.
Yes,
Okay, so there's different setbacks for 1 and 2 story structures in this zone?
correct.
Okay, so everything on the red setback is the setback for the 2 story elements.
Mhm.
And then to the west of that or to the north of that are for the single story elements.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Would the applicant like to come up and make a presentation?
That's that Michael. Hello.
Hello.
Sit down. Wonderful.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hello, close. My name is Vicky Barbieri. I'm an architect, the architect in the Kedicha crew, who has been in charge to design this project. Here is my project manager, Manuel, and we've been before with you in this project. Will you have comments? We have responded to each of them, like modifying floor plans to modify the facades, add shades in some of the garages that look like they were not there. And I don't memorize all the comments that you have. But if you have any other question or you would like to discuss some item, I'm here.
Well, please stay here and we'll see if there's any questions.
I'm not going anywhere. If you don't approve my project, I'm not going anywhere.
All right. Are there any questions of the applicant?
it's not specifically related to this, but the last time we got together, we talked about the relationship of this project to the gas company building. Is there an update? Is it gas company? Yes,
Well-
water company.
My
No,
response
yes.
was, there is not connection one project with the other one, they are two different properties, two different elements, two different uses. No, I don't, we have not relate to the architecture of the project in the corner, like we haven't relate to the architecture on the other side, on the front, on the back. This is a project that been developed and thought up more to the location where it is, that is Palm Springs. And try to respond to what Palm Springs represent to us. That would be my answer.
Staff have an update on what's going on with the gas building?
Do I need the mic? Sorry. Oh, thank you. So, the project, from my understanding, is, in the process of being designated a class 1. As far as the finalized, design of that, I think it's still it's still under review with the historic preservation officer.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Does anybody want to look and study, compare and contrast the exhibits? The exhibits were good. We appreciate that. They allowed us to see the modifications.
We work a lot.
It's obvious. Seeing none. All right. Well, we appreciate your guys' time. Thank you.
We leave, no?
Yeah, you can leave. All right, well, I would entertain a motion. So we'll have a motion, we'll have a second, and then we'll have some further discussion, if any.
I'll go ahead and make an motion to approve as submitted this time around. I think it looks much better with the facade adjustments to the building.
Second.
All right, we have a motion and we have a second. Any
Who was the second?
further discussion? Any further discussion?
You know, I'll just say that I appreciate the response to the facade that I particularly made mention of at the last meeting, which was that long expanse of that second level balcony, and it's now broken. I appreciate that.
Any other discussion? All right, we've got a motion, we've got a second. Let's have a roll call vote.
Member Castro,
Yes.
Member Thompson,
Yes.
Member McDonald,
Yes.
Member Baston,
Yes.
Member Harlan, Member Walsh.
Yeah.
Vice Chair Thomas.
Yeah, I still have a little trepidation with not knowing what's happening to the adjacent property, particularly with the pool, but I will vote in favor.
And Chair O'Donnell.
Yes.
The vote passes 7-0.
All right, thank you. All right, we have item 3A. A request by the Panetti Family Trust owner, represented by JMA Architecture, for a major architectural application to construct 3,950 square foot single family residence on a hillside parcel located on lot 542398 City View Drive, zone SCASP. Case number AR 20240076. Staff report, please.
Thank you, Chair. As you mentioned, this house is in Desert Palisades Pacific Plan at 2398 City View Drive. We'll start off with an aerial photograph showing where this lot is located. It is a 19,000 square foot lot. You'll notice that there Finally, our other houses that are developing in Palisades, and this lot is right adjacent to another lot. The adjacent neighbors were notified, and we did not hear any comments from any of them. Which, you know, part of our process is that we notify adjacent abutting property owners to make them aware of a housing project coming in and make them able to look at the plans, review, and give comments. We received none. So you see that there's a house that sits to the right of this vacant lot. City View Drive sits lower than the lot. There's about a 10-foot grade difference from a pad that will be graded for the new house versus the street. So because of those conditions, this is basically a split level house with the garage and other mechanical spaces underneath the main portion of the house. So here's a rendering of what the house will look like. As I mentioned, there is a driveway that leads into a motor court, which leads into the the garage. And as you know, Desert Palisades houses, there's an option or a preference that the garage doors do not face the street. In order to alleviate this, the driveway is curved. And when we get to the landscape plan, you'll see that there's landscaping that will try to screen the garage that faces the street. So the house is a little bit different than others you've seen in Desert Palisades. It has sloped roofs. Sloped roofs are permitted in Desert Palisades. There's a slope grade that they must meet, and this house does not exceed what is permitted in Desert Palisades. So this is a front view of the house looking from City View Drive. You'll notice that there's a pool off to the left that's in the front, and the bottom slide is the rear of the lot, showing a fire pit and other outdoor amenities to the rear. There's a site plan in your packet. There are two no build easements on the left and right side of the property. That's a 7.5 no build easement, and then the setback is based upon that. So they are not grading or touching any of the non-build easements. And then to the top of the slide, you'll see there's a lot R, which is a common lot area that is between the lots on the adjacent street, lots 32 and 33, and this lot itself. The grading plan shows grading around the site. This has been reviewed by the engineering department. There will be some revisions that they made to the grading plan after engineering first saw it. And this reflects some of the grades that they asked for, mainly in the front where the pool meets the street. There's some grading changes there, and there's a large culvert that runs under the street. We'd like to point out that in the right-hand side, there is a box showing the house that's actually finished now. It was under construction when this project started, it seems. And that gives us finished floor area for that house, which is 962, and this house is at 977. So it sits a little bit above the house, and we'll get to some cross sections in a minute. Landscape plan shows plant types that are permitted in the Desert Palisades plant list. They are Palo Verde trees and other large trees, and then shrubs and cactus and other material that is permitted in the development. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see that there's a large tree that's planted to shield, as I mentioned, the garage as it looks onto the street. Provided a lighting plan showing the type of lights that will be provided, uplights of trees and landscaping, and then some light poles to light pathways and sidewalks and driveways. Building elevations show how the plan will be split level with the garage door and then the sloped roofs. The maximum height of the house from grade or the finished pad to the top of the sloped roof is 16 feet 4 inches. And then there's a point where the garage at the bottom to the top of the house also is under 25 feet. In looking at cross sections, this shows how the internal workings of the house will be. There you can see the garage in the middle exhibit. There is a mechanical room that will hold all the mechanical equipment, air conditioning, heating, so forth. Also, this exhibit shows the split level nature of the house. And then a cross section. So this top exhibit shows the location of the adjacent house relative to this house. So this house does sit higher, but it does, the road slopes up. So in most cases, a house would be taller than the other one as you go up the street. The floor plan shows the 3 bedrooms of the house, the living room, great room, a gallery in the center of the house, kitchen, pantry, laundry room, and then the lower level includes the garage, a storage room, and then the mechanical room in the center of the core of the house with a stairwell that goes to the main floor. A roof plan is provided and it does show location of solar panels on the roof. They're kind of hard to see, but they are the dash lines in the center of the roof itself. Building materials consist of smooth plaster finish, multiple types, colors to be a beige or brown for the main body, some other exterior finishes are this green color and then darker color for aluminum frames, doors, and windows. There is exposed wood on the garage doors and the ceilings of the overhangs, and then 2 types of stone veneer that will be added onto the exterior of the house. So, Chair, that concludes my report. We are recommending approval as it meets all the setbacks and other development standards for Desert Palisades, and I believe the applicant is here.
Thank you, Glenn. Any questions of staff?
Mr. Chair.
Yes.
Glenn, there was no need for application to deal with encroachment outside of the height limit or the setbacks, is that correct?
That's correct. There is, when you measure it, there is a portion of a eave that extends like in this middle slide at the very right-hand side. The building does not extend, but the eave does, and that's a permitted use.
It is permitted, right, okay. Thanks.
Right.
Any other questions of staff?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Hey, Glenn, on sheet A,
Dan, can you take the microphone, please?
on sheet A 4.3, where it shows the solar on the building section, is that covered from view at in any angle?
Right.
You can see them sloping up slightly.
So-
Where will you see that from?
You can get to some of the. So in this side exhibit, you'll see at the bottom exhibit, it shows solar panels. So it's a flat portion of the roof that's in the center of the house, above the gallery and above the garage.
Well, it looks like there's like parapet walls on 2 ends, but on the end that where you can see the slope of it, is there anything that's blocking your view of seeing the solar panels from that direction and from the other
I'll
side?
have to have the applicant answer that question.
Okay, thank you.
Glenn, I've got a question. So just so this board knows, we had another Palisade project tonight that was placed on the consent calendar. This one we are reviewing as a full project. So is that due to the non-conformance of the garage primarily, or is there another thing that we should be aware of?
It is due to the fact that this is the first house that has sloped roofs.
Okay, fair enough. All right, would the applicant like to come forward and make a presentation?
Yeah, it's been pretty friendly.
Say Jim.
Good evening, I'm Jim McIntosh with JMA Architects. Thank you for the comprehensive presentation of our project tonight. I appreciate that. I think you've covered pretty much everything I would have covered. So I'm here to answer any further questions and talk about these sloped roofs.
All right, any questions for the project representative? All right, fire away.
So did you hear my question about the solar panels?
You were concerned about a particular angle
Yeah, I'm
that
just wondering
might
if-
be visible?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you can see it, is there a parapet wall around the whole thing or how?
Yeah, it's a little parapet wall, but we're not doing a steep angle on the panels either. And so all of our line of sight studies through sections, I'm very confident that you're not gonna be able to see any of the solar panels.
Can you skirt the panels?
Any what?
Put a skirt around the panels?
Put a skirt? Well, it's not really necessary. I mean, typically we do a skirt around a panel when it's on a sloped roof that's exposed, so you're not seeing underneath it. But these are all occurring on areas where,
You can't really see it.
yeah, that angle's not really ever gonna be seen.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Okay, great.
Let me see. I have some issues with the pool in the front.
Good.
And I think maybe the landscape architect, if he could kind of walk us through that infinity edge and the fence and the walkway and the boulders and all that, how that works. Because I'm getting a little confused over what's going on there. With elevations and the boulder placement and things like that.
Mr. Dosey, would you like to come up,
Thank you.
please? We got a little chair for you.
Okay.
Could we go back to one of the renderings first, and then we can go to the plan? So in regards to the Tom Dosey, TKD Landscape Architects. So in regards to, if you look at this rendering on the top and northeast perspective, you'll see over to the left of the entry there's just one little section of infinity edge. And it'll be perceived more as like a water feature that comes down towards the front. And then with all the boulders and materials on site, the idea is to work all of those in to create this entryway. Originally, at one time, there was, we were reviewing actually using walls to make up the grade and steps and everything. But upon review with the HOA, it was decided to use more of the natural materials and boulders to do the retaining and then allow the walkway and steps to come up behind the actual rock work and planting.
Okay, because on your plan, on your landscape plan, I don't know if this is like a graphic thing, but it shows the infinity edge, and then it shows like a large gray area past the infinity edge that makes it L shape. So, what is that supposed to be the receiving pool for the water, or is that supposed to be maybe blue instead?
It's the bond beam that's wrapping around there.
So the bond beam is that thick, right? I mean, so you have your infinity edge, and then because it just doesn't seem like that's enough space.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we could take a look at that and minimize it, but well, it retains though too.
Well, yeah, it's not this isn't your typical infinity edge. The water's not cascading over the top edge. It's
Okay,
actually a 1-inch thick acrylic wall that's about 6 inches high. And the water level's about an inch below that. So there will be some splash when somebody jumps in the pool, does a cannonball. And so there is a little trough on the outside to catch that spill. But the idea of this isn't.
so it's like a negative edge then, with an acrylic edge.
Yeah, you can say that, but even a negative edge spills, but this doesn't spill. The water level is gonna be at about an inch below the top of the acrylic wall.
So the water will drop over the side when the water's rough.
Correct,
Go into a smaller trough.
that's correct.
Okay, and then that large gray mass, that's your bond beam.
Yes, and that is just also giving us some additional mass in that corner, just for the composition of that landscape element.
Okay,
So that
because,
trough doesn't need to, most infinity troughs need to be designed to handle the surcharge, which is the water surface that rises above the infinity edge.
correct,
And we
yeah.
don't have that. So that's why the trough isn't really very large at all.
Okay, so there isn't like an acrylic edge that runs across there,
There is.
you know, so you'll be able to see water.
Yeah, there'll be a little band, and that's why if you look on that rendering, that is, that blue band that you see there is actually seeing into the pool. It's not blue tile or something that you would normally see on an infinity edge.
Okay,
That's actually seeing, yeah, if you zoom, that, you're actually seeing into the water at that point, that 6-inch band.
because I'm seeing how you have the gate there at, you know, an elevation, I assume is, you know, code. And then you have a like boulder massing on the front side, then you have boulder massing in front of the, you know, the exposed water edge.
Right.
So what's to keep people from kind of climbing up the rocks and going in the pool?
Well, we have a 5-foot height, and that's what the code requires.
But if there's rocks there,
Yeah, but somebody can climb a 5-foot fence as well. I mean,
but I
you
mean,
say that
you
same
can't
thing.
have you can't have a climbable surface. You can't have something that has a grabbable,
Well,
a rock isn't, and a pool.
well, all I can say is we've done this before and it's a deterrent. Because even a fence isn't preventative, it's more of a deterrent. And that is what meets the California requirement for a safety fence around the pool.
So I see you have the pool fence coming down and then it just kind of stops there at the corner.
Right, because at that point, as the stairs go up, that's where we're required to fence it in. Once the stairs get to a point where we don't have a 5-foot retaining wall anymore. You know, as the stairs go up, we have less and less retaining. And therefore, we don't have that 5-foot requirement, and that's where the fence occurs.
Can I just say, we have a little bit more experience now working with houses in Desert Palisades. And we're finding that these houses do have to add some sort of unclimbable fence around these pools. We've seen them have to add picket steel. I mean, they're very decorative and then go with the house. So all I can say is that when it goes through plan check, we will look at what will prevent that.
Because also, you know, there's the, you know, you can basically probably climb over the rocks and just walk into the front from, you know, from the other side of the pool. Towards the main entry, you know, as you go up the stairs, this doesn't show your gate.
Right.
Okay, so you're hiding the gate behind boulders,
Right.
apparently, because I don't think we'd want to see the gate in the front yard. I mean, the side of the gate of the pool fence. So that means that you'd have to have that 5 feet somehow, make it up that staircase.
Right. Well, that's the concept. At any time you're working with boulders, it's a really on-site exercise where the landscape architect is out there, I'm out there, as we're placing boulders. We're not leaving it up to, you know, the installer to just place boulders.
Yeah, and then the bigger picture though is that, I don't know, do you really think it's appropriate to have like an infinity edge street facing in that neighborhood?
It's not an infinity edge.
A negative edge, or if you're gonna see water, or you're gonna see
I don't-
pool.
Why wouldn't it be?
I don't know, it's kind of a desert community, I just saw. You know, and
It's not a
great.
big waterfall. It's a little slice of blue. You don't even really.
Okay,
I mean, I think there's plenty of places I've wandered in the desert where you see a little bit of water.
the other question I have is that, on a planting plan, you know, you have a pretty, you know, naturalistic planting plan. So, which looks good. What is gonna be the end ground cover? I mean, the inner ground cover, what will be the end ground cover that'll just finish it off? Are you going to kind of like rehabilitate the just kind of rake in the natural soil? Or,
Correct. The goal is to renaturalize the soil with some of the cobbles and smaller materials there and have that evenly broadcast so it has more of a natural surface rather than, you know, covering it with dingy material. So that it will get naturalized.
okay, then you have a DG path that goes around, something like that.
Correct, yeah, and we did that so it was separately delineated. For volume.
Okay. Yeah, I just, that's gonna be quite a, you know, a hairy section there to get that to look right in that corner of the stairs and boulders. And be covered.
What we've found up there is, even once they start excavating and grading, there's, you know, you can try to manage and design around the existing boulders that you see on the surface, but as they get into the project, more of it starts to appear, so as Jim pointed out, it's kind of hands-on to mitigate those areas, and, you know, work with them in an aesthetic manner, but also, you know, functionally to work with our landscape material and pathways.
Okay, so I guess the only outstanding thing is truly making it, you know, pool code completely in the front.
Yes, and we'll review that, we can, I think once, this project gets underway and the grading starts, you know, if we see some, you know, areas of opportunity where we have more of a level space that we can work with, truly gain, you know, the 5 feet without any boulders nearby that somebody could climb, that would certainly be our
Yeah,
preference.
because I mean, you know, boulders are not a barrier, they are not a pool barrier.
Correct. So as we go through it, we'll make those adjustments. I mean, the fence, you know, may not be in the exact same straight line as we show it now, but we may have to inset it or move it back and forth to maintain that.
Yeah, the whole front, if you can go to the elevation in the front.
The rendering.
Yeah, the rendering, please, I'm sorry. It just, I don't know, it just seems really kind of forced. You know, I'm just not a fan of that. I think there's some other ways you could handle that.
What looks forced?
Well, it's, you know, it's the massing of the boulders. And it's kind of like it's kind of like just a huge angle that just kind of goes up and abruptly drops into the driveway. You know, maybe it's, you know, because the rendering doesn't show any of the other, you know, well, it doesn't show really any of the plants that are on the plan list. I really can't make out what those are. So, but I just think it's just, I don't know, it's just a very odd, it seems to just be kind of just an odd and clunky look in the front of the house.
I mean, the goal as the project moves forward, you know, is to create as many planting pockets within.
Oh, no, I agree. I think that's a great idea. It's just that there's something about the way that elevation is right now with the boulders, the way the staircase works. You have just a little bit of pool showing, and then you're gonna have that fence that's gonna be kind of coming straight out at you from the side.
May I suggest, Member McDonald, can we look at this as a possible addition to a motion that we may be making later for the applicant to check out.
Sure.
Cause I'm hearing the landscape architect and the architect saying that this is a concept. They're gonna encounter Volkswagen-sized boulders out there that are non-climbable. And they're gonna have to put them somewhere, and some of these have that deep patina on them, and they're just beautiful because nature has been patinaing them for geologic eras.
But
And
you do understand that boulders can't be a barrier.
I think Mr. Malaker has mentioned that they do have experience in the Palisades. The applicant is saying that their design intent is to create a beautiful front. And, I think we just need to move on. And if we want to couch that in a motion or a portion of a motion, we can do that.
If I may also, Mr. Chair, the issue of determining what's appropriate once this thing is up and being put together will be the building code official. So I think we can rest this with the understanding that the building official is going to drive what makes an acceptable pool barrier. So I think that for me gives me enough comfort to know that I think it will be done both in a safe way and in a way that works aesthetically.
Thank you for that, Mr. Lyon. Mr. McDonald, any further comments?
No.
Okay. Member Walsh.
I did not realize that sloped roofs were uncharted territory. So I guess I have to take the bait and understand, this is an opportunity for you to explain to us the evolution of the design and how you just came up with such a rakish and unusual sloped roof scheme.
How dare you?
Well, when you're on the site, you're at the foot of the San Jacinto Mountains. And your view lines just want to go up. And it just, the site goes up to the slope, or on quite a bit of a slope, just in the topography. And it just felt like a natural sight line being that close to the mountain to look up. And then on the other side, we have more flat roofs that are looking down valley. And that was basically the inspiration, no magic beyond that.
That's like a 2 and 12 or something.
I don't even believe it's 2 and 12. I think it's a 1 and 12.
It seems to help break up your massing.
Yeah. Even though it's a 1 and 12, which is pretty flat, it's a big plane. And so it really opens up that main area and brings a lot of nice light in and just raises your eye up towards the houses.
Thank you.
Member Castro.
That's me.
Member Bastian.
Sorry. I didn't have any questions. I just wanted to say that I think it's gorgeous. I love the way that it is sort of a little bit built into the mountain and it looks like it's popping out. So I love the rock formation sort of that's sloping down. I love that you're using color, a little bit of green in there. So yeah, I love it. I think it looks good.
Thank you.
My turn.
Member Castro.
Okay, thank you. I too think this design is beautiful. I think that I really appreciate the color palette. I'm getting tired of seeing a lot of white and gray and black, and this isn't. I'd like the nice muted green and the colors being used. I think the rock design is going to evolve as you design it, and I think it's going to change when I'm looking at it from this perspective, when I'm going to look at it as I walk around the house, as I go to the driveway. It's going to provide interest. I'm excited to see what you come up with, and how you address it even in and around the pool area. I love the slope design. I think it gives this soaring effect, especially as it is an elevated design and topography.
Sorry.
Yeah.
It's good. Sorry.
Thank you.
Should use that word. Next day.
Member Thomas,
You know,
ditto.
to everything that's been said, I agree. I think it's beautiful. I am not tired of white and gray.
I like it.
I'm biased towards white and gray, but I think it's beautiful. I think it sits in the surroundings perfectly. And I actually like the little peekaboo view of the pool, a little bit of blue. I think it's really tastefully done. I think and I'm a big fan of Field Verify. It's really nice to put these things on paper, but the reality is when you are on the site and working the site, nature's gonna help you evolve and decide what's most important and how best to satisfy the site. So I'm comfortable with leaving it in the hands of the people on site and building and safety and not the crane operator.
All right, thank you. I think the pool makes a lot of sense. It's in the wind shadow of the house, so the outdoor spaces are protected. And you've got the great down valley, south and southeast views. So all those things are working. I'd like to just have you guys walk us through where is the privacy between this house and the existing house to the northeast? What measures are there? Abundance of windows there? What's going on there that you've taken into consideration with your design?
The one directly adjacent to it?
Yeah, the one that's built.
Well, we did a close look at that because it was in the framing stage when we first started doing our layout. And if you'll notice, it is sort of a U-shaped house that looks back up almost to the canyon where the tram goes up and down there. And so it's looking back across the corner of our property. And that was one of the reasons we put our garage where we did, to give that buffer space, and doing our more public area on the opposite corner where it's most sunny. And like you said, the wind shadow from the predominant winds. And I think that allows us good separation. As we rotated the house on the plan 45 degrees, it kept that corner of our property open for the neighboring house to maintain that view quarter that they've sort of established for themselves. And those are, the secondary bedrooms along that area with minimum windows, looking down to them. So I think there's a certain sense of privacy between the two properties.
Jim, can you also walk us through a couple of site sections? What's going on with the topography going through your lot, and how does it relate to the existing, the home that's being built and the future home that will be to the south?
Well, let's go to the site plan that shows some topography or the grading plan possibly. So you can see the high point is to the back left corner of the property. And it sort of slopes down.
Is north up in this diagram? No.
Yes, north is pretty much straight up.
Straight up?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so it's coming down and, the natural flow of the water. There's certain lots that are very restricted because there's a flow line that goes through them that can't be disturbed. We were fortunate that we didn't have that condition, but the way the house sort of steps up, we're not doing any big pads or big cuts. We're starting down low with our vehicular access, tucked down low into the garage, and then the main part of the house sits at that medium grade. And as the lot slopes up to the north, we actually go up another 2 feet there, so the bedrooms are up. So we're not digging ourselves into the slope right there. We're sort of trying to stay at grade as much as we can and traveling up with the natural slope of the lot. And to me, it sort of nestles itself in nicely that way. The only real big retaining walls are between the garage and the main house, so the garage and the back area. Other than that, everything is working with natural slopes.
And the retaining being those dashed lines?
Well, that is sort of the front and. I'm not sure how Keith, our civil engineer, is showing that. He's showing retaining areas, but we're not really using walls anymore. We're doing it all with boulders. I think he had to show that to indicate where retaining was happening within the boulders. There is retaining to the north of the garage there. There's a 4 and 5 foot high wall where we have our utility area to the side. But you know what? That's not our current plan.
Walls.
Yeah, do you have a more current plan? Because that's not our current plan. Because that's when, there we go. See how that other plan actually showed a 3-car garage? We didn't get very far with that. So we went to a 2-car garage and a carport. So here we go. But this isn't the precise grading plan. This is my architectural site plan.
And the intent here is to just minimize the garage door.
Correct. The house is rotated at 45 degrees from the street, a little close to, and then it kind of curves around. And we had studied some ways of, turning the garage 90 degrees to the street, but you really end up disturbing so much more of the lot when you have to make a turnabout in a comfortable area to get in and out of your garage when it's 90 degrees. We just didn't want to disturb that much of the natural terrain.
Jim, what is that? What is the material for the wall that you're using on that north side? What is that?
On the north side. Which wall in particular?
That one?
Those are stucco walls.
Okay.
Smooth, finished stucco walls.
All right, any further questions for the project representatives? All right, well, we thank you.
Well, thank you, and thank you for putting your trust in us to creatively put in these boulders. I'm confident we're gonna do this in a really successful way and solve all the problems and make it look great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, any further discussion? All right, looks like everybody's had a chance to chime in. All right, Member Wall.
A couple things. I think it's a very well organized floor plan. There's something to be said for just a simple approach like that. Also, there has been no need for an AMM or any adjustment for encroachment in terms of height or setbacks, and so many times to get these lots to work, that's kind of incorporated. And it looks like they kind of stayed within the confines, and that's, I'm impressed.
I think you should turn that into a motion.
Shall I keep going?
Yes, keep going.
Okay. Motion to approve. Do we have any conditions on it?
Well, they've got some recommendations down there.
Mm-hmm. How might we handle that?
Ken, do we need to add your recommendation, adopt the resolution determining exempt from CEQA, blah, blah, blah? Okay, so
Yes.
probably just read that verbatim.
You're basically basing your recommendation to approve of the findings outlined in the staff report.
Okay.
Right, in support of the staff report, right?
You're adopting the findings that are outlined in the staff. With more.
Russ, would there be any amendments that you would want to put
No.
All right, we've got a motion. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
We got a motion and a second. Any further discussion?
I think it's a very handsome house. I really like it. I don't have any problem as far as the garage door facing the street.
Russ, please use your microphone.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think it's a very handsome house. And I think it's gonna look great on the lot. I don't have any problems with the front facing garage. I worked on the Finn Cabby residence up there, and that one was front facing garage, that's not a problem. Yeah, so, yeah, I mean, if everybody's, comfortable with, you know, people in the field and, doing the right thing, then I think it's good to go. As far as I'm concerned.
Okay, we got a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Seeing none. Can we have a roll call vote, please?
Member Castro,
Yes.
member Thompson,
Yes.
member McDonald,
Yes,
member Baston,
Yes.
member Walsh,
Yes.
Vice Chair Thomas,
Yes.
and Chair O'Donnell.
Yes, all right.
Motion passes 7-0.
Carries unanimous. Thank you, gentlemen. All right, so we got architectural committee reports, requests and comments. I do have a request. Feels like I've made it before. Sometimes I don't know who the staff member is, like for instance, AR. And if you guys could just put their name in, it would just help me address people appropriately.
Sure.
Notwithstanding the excessive passion.
Good comment.
Yeah. Any other requests?
You know, I kind of have just a question on the consent calendar, item 1B was the Vista Palizada property, and I thought I recall that being not on the consent when it first came around, and then that was on the consent now. So I just wanted to know, am I wrong, or why do things change to consent?
No, it was on the consent both
Was it?
times.
Was it? Sorry.
Yeah,
Was it not considered? Is that what happened and it came back?
there were questions.
I think,
I'll jump in.
I think we pulled it.
We pulled it, there
We
were
pulled it
questions
because
on
there
the
were some issues.
contractor who was prohibited from doing work in the Palisades, and it
I
just
see.
created a little bit of fuss with the HOA.
And I don't have a problem with it, but why is something like that on the consent and then like the project we just had is not on? the
Slope
consent?
roofs.
We generally,
okay.
we will generally put cases on the consent agenda that we believe are non-controversial. And we do that merely out of expediency of time.
Okay,
So if ever there's a case that is on consent and you have some concerns about it,
we can pull it.
always feel
Okay,
free to pull it.
I mean, we could have gotten to a long discussion about 1B, that home, about where the front door was.
which house was 1B?
1B was in the Palisades.
Palisade.
Okay, I'm sorry, which was the one that is on Sunrise?
On what?
The one that's on Sunrise,
some roads.
That's 1C.
That's one
and
thing.
that one kind of went through too, right?
Yes.
Correct.
Okay,
So did they just swap out the contractor and the issue went away?
It became an internal issue for them. They gave you guys the green light and everything kind of went away, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
yeah, just a point, I know,
Please use your mic.
oh, I'm sorry. Just, on that, when we kind of like push those others through on consent. You know, there was a couple of items I did want to bring up on that one house, but it was kind of like, you know, we went really fast. Maybe if we can slow that down just a little bit, you know, before we jam it through.
Is there a half measure between pulling it and just commenting for?
No, here's what I'm going to say to you.
Yeah.
Review your packets before you come.
Yeah.
And if you have something for which you want to have a conversation, ask a question, have a concern or a real problem with, pull it.
Well, what I did was I went through that, I went through the file. And I looked at it. But when the numbers were flying back and forth, I was trying to, you know, match up to the one that was there, and it was just too late.
Yeah.
So it's like,
Always be aware when you get your agendas, always be aware when you get your agendas, anything that's under that consent agenda portion, you will not be discussing unless you want to. And at that point, if there's something that you are unclear about, that you just, even sometimes, you know, you will see the council pull an item because they want to emphasize something about it.
Yeah.
you're welcome to do that as well. We put things on consent to try to keep your time, here sitting with all of us, as short as possible.
You know, because that house slid through with absolutely no landscape on the whole west side, on the street side.
On the one at Sunrise,
Yeah, literally nothing.
if you see those kinds of things and you wanna pull them, always feel comfortable to pull them if you've got questions.
Yeah, I mean, it was just, it was a rookie mistake for me. I mean, I was trying to get to the, because when the number, the presentation was, we're going back and forth, I was trying to find which one that was.
Yeah,
Well, let's have a little context here. So those homes were placed on a special review because they're fronting on a major thoroughfare. There's an extra 30 feet of setback beyond the 25 required setback. So help me out here. How far are those things set back from a major thoroughfare?
the setbacks are only different on Tockwitz and East Palm Canyon. The reason that a house like that is a non-hillside house came before you is because the architectural review section of the zoning code identifies that those houses that are on a major thoroughfare on a lot that is greater than 10,000 square feet comes before you. So there's no other magic to it in terms of those setbacks on those kinds of streets. You're right, there are some streets that do have special setbacks. Sunrise is not one of them.
But
But
so,
that's the reason that one, you know, even came to you, because it's not a hillside lot, you know, it's.
And it's not really in a special neighborhood either. But that's, you know, so my question for staff would be the acceptance of the agenda. It feels kind of odd that note abstentions, which is fine. We can note abstentions at that point. But consent calendar request feels like it should come after I don't know, it just, like, everybody should know we're about to move into the consent calendar and it's time to say pull or keep. And because I had to mention that in the acceptance of the agenda, Russ was probably like, okay, I'll get another bite at the apple here, you know, in the future. And it, because it feels a little odd. I don't know, is there a better way to do it?
We can make a bit more deliberate statement about this as you guys are going through acceptance of the agenda. And emphasize the fact if anyone does wish to pull, now's the time to pull.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can do that.
Because
No, that sounds great.
you did do consent calendar, public comments, so they
Yep.
went back to consent calendar.
Yeah, yeah. So just a little bit, if we could just adjust that, that'd probably help us.
All of that said, it still is a good concept that, you know, you do revisit these things in terms of just getting it on the consent calendar in the interest of time.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's a good thing.
It's a very good thing.
I mean, I could have pulled all three of these for different reasons.
Yeah.
But, you know, at the end of the day, do I wanna take this group's time and the public to hear, why did you put the front door, why do you have to go by the pool to get to the front door? You're in a private community. It's either gonna sell or it's not gonna sell if you make these big mistakes, so it's, you know, why am I gonna give you free advice on, you know, shifting the garage floor, bring a proper entry? Just, you just wanna bang your head against the wall at some point.
well, landscape wise, it was one of those situations on, especially that house. Where the Sunrise is actually very nice, has a very nice streetscape going towards Vistachino. Or
Southbound?
yeah, northbound. And it's you know, there's just now there's like kind of like a big gap there. You know, it's just gonna be a big blank wall with just a couple of cactus.
Well, I'm sure it's a proud homeowner that will wanna beautify their street frontage, so.
Well, it'd be nice if we actually made them do it.
Yeah, well, I have, you know,
Yeah.
I have issues sometimes that we spend an enormous amount of time on landscaping and then it goes in. And then you just let it all die and it's not enforced by the city as far as making sure they maintain it. So I have a hard time spending almost our entire meetings on landscaping when it's not enforced.
Well,
maybe,
you know,
maybe I should just
there's-
be the board.
Well,
You don't need a
I hear
landscape architect, it's all architects.
I know,
hear
but
you.
it's
I
that's
hear
just my point.
We need
Wow.
a durability consultant.
Well,
Once you pass your final nothing gets revisited.
Well, but that's-
But
I
it
mean-
should though, especially when it's on a commercial building in a condo complex or something like that, where it's more vocal, more something you can see all the time. An individual home, I get, but when it's some of these complexes downtown, for example, and you're required to know all these plants, and then I go in and it's like every third one is dead or missing.
Well, look at
Like-
the Biltmore, I mean, look at the Biltmore on on Palm Canyon. Since I moved here, they've literally torn out 80% of the landscape. And there's absolutely no consequences.
And to me, I mean, I think that's a different function of the city. The city
Yeah.
needs to enforce. I mean, we need to do our jobs. But, I mean, I still think we need to talk about landscaping and everything else, but.
I mean, if you have a zero landscape, then you have a zero landscape. But
Yeah.
if you have a landscape that's full of something, and then they decide to take it out later, well, then at least you've got,
Well, there needs to be like teeth in the enforcement and.
It's a matter of enforcement. And I've often said this as I've been sitting here at this table, that, the city has a finite amount of resources in every department. And code enforcement is probably one of those that have a heavier, load of everything around the city. Than those of the city and the planning department. But having said that, any of you who are citizens of the city who see something and want to say something, there is a link on the city website to code enforcement. Use it if you see stuff. Please use it if you see stuff. That's why it's there. And that's why we have citizens who do care. So use that code enforcement if you see things like that that really upset you. It happens in our parking lots for our commercial centers. It happens throughout the city. We're aware of it. We had a severe loss of plant material this summer, as you guys know. And we've been working with code enforcement to try to deal with a lot of that right now too.
And Measure J did get, the new measure it did pass, so now it's permanent, so you can use your voice there as well in terms of how those dollars are spent.
All right, Mr. Lyon, what does our meeting schedule look like? Another meeting in December, or are we going? right
No, this
to-
is the last meeting for December. We are waiting to get we put together the draft set of meeting schedules for the year in planning. So we do it for you, HSPB, Planning Commission, City Council, Sustainability. And they've not been finalized yet for 2025. We're hoping they come out soon. So look for the next meeting for this group to be, I believe it's January 6th. Like the company says that on our agenda, that I'm not looking at as I say that, but I think that's the date. Is that right?
Yep.
Yes, so your next meeting will be January 6th.
And tell us about the workload that you guys are seeing in the planning department and how that might portend future busyness for this group.
There's a lot that's coming through. It varies in terms of the kind of stuff. I'm working on Serena Park, I'm working on Orchid Tree, I'm working on the CUP. A lot of those, and I'm working on a couple of golf course conversion applications that are not gonna be hitting this desk until the actual vertical construction gets submitted. But there are projects that are coming through, and so it's gonna be probably a pretty steady pace. We've had a few meetings canceled this year. It was just the way that the timing and everything was happening in terms of processing. Sometimes we wind up having like too many things get all bunched up, and then we've got to kind of push them around on the agendas, but generally, we're seeing a pretty steady flow.
And I do recall we had an applicant that had a former gas station that they had a project they wanted to off of Mesquite Avenue over in that neighborhood. Do you know what happened to that? The planning director was in here, it was gonna be appealed, the city attorney got involved.
That will be on your January 6th meeting.
Okay.
The one that came before us?
No,
It
it
didn't
didn't.
come before you because there was a problem in which one of the applicants' team was not available. And so at the request of the appellant and applicant, we pulled it, and it will be heard by this group on January 6th.
Anything?
Good memory, by
further?
the way.
What's that?
Good memory.
Yeah, no, it seemed like a big deal, cause you wanted me to come in to the principal's office and find out what to say. All right, so it is 6:43, we will adjourn the meeting of the Architectural Advisory Committee, City of Palm Springs.
Thank you all.
Thank you.